Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine, October 6, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Dan Severn pulls out of UFC title fight for Pride debut card. FMW Stadium show with WWF match. Observer expansion, and much more. By Observer staff. After several days with numerous contingency plans being discussed, the plans for the Maurice Smith vs. Dan Severn UFC heavyweight title match main event of the October 17th pay-per-view show remain intact with an asterisk. Problems with the match surfaced when the Pride 1 promotion in Japan held a press conference on September 24th and announced that Severn would be replacing Tank Abbott in the match with Chemo. The semifinal to the Hickson Gracie vs. Nobuhiko Takada match on October 11th at the Tokyo Dome. It was actually part of a double whammy to Semaphore Entertainment Group's pay-per-view plans, as in addition, Gary Goodridge, who was scheduled in the heavyweight tournament, signed a deal to work the show in a match against Oleg Toktarov. Semaphore Entertainment Group officials were initially very upset, far more about Severn agreeing to do the show than Goodridge, for a number of reasons. Semaphore Entertainment Group and Pride 1 had meetings just a few days earlier regarding helping each other out, and within a week of the meetings, the Pride 1 people signed two fighters Semaphore Entertainment Group had planned to put on a pay-per-view show 6 days after the Pride 1 show. In the case of Severn, it put Semaphore Entertainment Group in a bad position, because any sort of injury to Severn in the Chemo match would force them to change the main event of the pay-per-view show with 6 days or less notice. Discussions were made with several fighters over the next few days, with Smith being amenable to changing the match, including serious discussions of Vitor Belfort being given the shot. The final decision was made to go with the original plans, but also have a backup plan ready to implement at the last minute on the chance Severn is injured in the match with Chemo. While the backup plan hasn't been released, it is known that it would involve a fighter not currently on the show being brought in, and the undercard would stay the same. Because the event is being sanctioned by the Mississippi State Athletic Commission, even if Severn doesn't have a serious injury but has a cut, it is likely the commission wouldn't let him fight, which is why having a backup plan becomes a necessity. Severn, who is currently training in Iowa with the idea of winning 2 major fights during a 6-day period, has a 17-3-1 NHB record, and in none of his matches to this point, including the losses, was he injured to the point he wouldn't have been able to do a match the next week, so the odds appear to be in his favor of surviving the first match. Still, when Oleg Toktarov attempted to do 2 major fights in 10 days last November, it backfired on him big time. Severn won't be fighting Yasunori Matsumoto on October 12th at Tokyo Sumo Hall, as was being advertised in Japan at last word, a fight he claimed he had never agreed to and never even been approached to do until well after it was being advertised. He also canceled an independent pro wrestling booking on October 15th in Sioux City, Iowa due to its proximity to the UFC show as soon as he agreed to take the UFC match. Even provided he handles Chemo with ease, which is a big if, he'll still have to deal with jet lag and the training break that 2 long flights to and from Japan just a few days prior to the fight will cause. Many are questioning him taking the fight, which on paper doesn't appear to be an easy fight. From a Semaphore Entertainment Group standpoint, there is also the risk. How large a risk is subject to debate, since the general feeling is Severn would be favored against Chemo, 7-2, whose only losses have come against Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock, ironically 2 of the 3 people who have beaten Severn, who is said to be around 250 pounds or much heavier than his appearance in December's Ultimate, that perhaps Severn would lose his first match and then win the second, which hurts the mythical image of the UFC heavyweight champion as being the best fighter on the planet. It is believed Severn was offered $40,000 for the match in Japan, to replace Abbott, who due to legal reasons stemming from an alleged fight with one of his friends on September 14th, was being advised by his lawyer not to leave the country. There may be more to the story than that, since Severn claims he was approached to fight Chemo at the Dome several weeks ago, well before the announcement went public on September 24th. It's a match that he's been wanting for more than 1 year, and several organizations have discussed it with him, but it had always fallen through. There had been rumors in Japan of the promotion, after originally attempting and even announcing Abbott vs. Chemo, of telling both Abbott and Chemo that the other one wasn't willing to do the fight even though both were willing, which also indicates Severn may have been considered for the show all along. Semaphore Entertainment Group officials had no idea of this match until September 25th at the earliest, as Severn or any of his representatives never contacted them, and it wasn't until September 29th when Severn finally talked with Semaphore Entertainment Group CEO Bob Merowitz to officially tell him he was going to do the Japan match. While Severn wouldn't specifically discuss publicly the figure he was getting for the Smith match, he admitted going in at a very low figure whether he wins or loses, although there is a small bonus for winning and also a bonus for winning before the time limit expires, far less than the Japan match and nowhere close to what he earned in his last UFC match against Mark Coleman. $50,000 guarantee with $100,000 going to the winner of that match, because he wanted to redeem himself for his loss to Coleman. The general feeling is that Severn, as a very good large wrestler who is in great cardiovascular shape, could be from a matchup standpoint the most difficult opponent possible for Smith. Those close to Smith, including the Shamrocks, who are training Smith for the match, see Severn as being a much harder fight because of the way they match up than either Belfort, who theoretically would fight the match on his feet, which is Smith's strength, or Coleman, who could physically overpower Smith but didn't have the stamina to last in a long match. However, taking the fight in Japan this close to the match certainly increases Smith's chances. It is believed that Severn got the title shot initially, after Coleman had to back out of the match after tearing his ACL in training and needing reconstructive surgery, because he was willing to go in at a low price given Semaphore Entertainment Group's budgetary restraints in these times where the pay-per-view situation makes it very difficult if not impossible to turn a profit on the show. Perhaps due to a belief that since Coleman beat him handily and Smith handled Coleman, therefore Smith should beat him, which would theoretically lead to Smith versus Belfort for the December show, which doesn't take into account how Smith and Severn match up against each other. Severn's feeling is that if he had been given the ultimatum to choose one match by Semaphore Entertainment Group, he'd have picked Japan, not primarily because it offered more money, but because he feels his business future for the next 10 to 15 years will be as a pro wrestler in Japan. As it was, no ultimatum was given by Semaphore Entertainment Group. Severn felt a victory over Kimo, who is a star in Japan due to wins over several pro wrestlers in shoot matches and appearances on K1 shows, in a shoot match at the Tokyo Dome, would be better for his business career long-term than a victory over Smith in the U.S., even though that victory would make him the first two-time UFC heavyweight champion and make him the most decorated person in the history of that organization. It is known that over the past several days, Semaphore Entertainment Group had contacted Marco Ruiz and Belfort about the title match, and there had been at least discussion given to Mark Kerr and Tom Erickson as well. Smith had agreed to whatever change Semaphore Entertainment Group wanted given the circumstances, and had been led to believe Belfort was a likely scenario. The eventual decision came down to Ruiz not willing to come back at the low main event price being offered by Semaphore Entertainment Group, the company not wanting to change its December plans, which are for the winner of Belfort versus Randy Couture to get the natural title shot at the champion, nor ruin what on paper is one of the best shows they've ever put on by taking Kerr or Belfort out of their scheduled slots. The October 17th show has a strong Kerr versus Carlisle Barreto potential tournament finals and two singles matches that look on paper at least to be both intriguing and competitive. Goodridge, who was offered $20,000 for the Japan match with Toktarov, well out of the ballpark of what he'd likely earn doing a UFC tournament that he wouldn't be expected to get out of the first round in. He's been replaced on the show by Stephen Graham 1-1 as Kerr's first round opponent. Graham, a 290-pound ex-college football lineman who physically resembles the pro wrestler Ice Train because of his enormous muscular bulk, lost in the finals of the last UFC heavyweight tournament to Couture. Semaphore Entertainment Group sent Severn a contract back at the end of August for the Smith match, which Severn had verbally agreed to money terms on, and in their contracts is a clause that prohibits fighters from taking any matches from the time they signed the contract until the UFC show. Severn hadn't signed the contract until after agreeing to the Pride 1 date, so the feeling is he violated the idea behind the contract even if technically he didn't violate the contract by agreeing to the Japan show. Severn was about 245 pounds 2 weeks out and that he'd be in the best condition since his winning the Ultimate in December 1995 for his attempt at a double, after which he'll go back to Japan at the end of October for a pro wrestling tour with IWA where he'll be part of its tag team tournament. He has also had more discussions of late with the WWF, however he doesn't want to be like Ken Shamrock and sign an exclusive deal with any one company. Severn has talked of retirement from NHB in the recent past, particularly as he approaches the age of 40, which he turns in June, but said the timing of a retirement from NHB depends on how long he feels he can stay competitive at the top level. With interpromotional help from both All Japan Pro Wrestling and the World Wrestling Federation, Frontier Martial Arts/Wrestling of Japan drew one of the largest crowds in company history on September 28 for its annual show at the Kawasaki Baseball Stadium. The crowd was announced as being 50,012 fans. We've had several live reports. Most indicated the real number was around 40,000. However, one report said that early in the show the 40,000 figure looked correct, but that the stadium, which should hold about 52,000 for wrestling, was almost completely filled by the time the top matches were into the ring, saying it was a late arriving crowd, not unusual at all for Japan. Due to that same day in nearby Tokyo there were huge sports crowds for a baseball game and a national soccer match that ended while the show was in its early stages. We don't have a gate figure other than FMW has done $2 million in the past in that building, and the ticket prices for this show were scaled higher than any FMW show at the stadium to date, ranging from $166 ringside down to $25. All live reports indicated it was a very good show, with the interpromotional tag team match involving All Japan's Kenta Kobashi and Manukia Mossman against FMW's Jinsei Shinzaki and Hayabusa being the highlight. The show airs on the Samurai Channel in Japan, edited down to a 90-minute format, on October 12. From an American standpoint, the biggest match on the show was what was billed as an Ultimate Fight Rules cage match involving the WWF's Ken Shamrock and Vader. The original match plan was for Shamrock to sell the rib injury theoretically suffered in the September 9 Muncie, Indiana match against Farouk, and Vader taking advantage of that injury would lead to his upset victory in Shamrock's specialty match, largely to build for a rematch similar to the idea behind the Shawn Michaels vs. Davey Boy Smith finish in England last week. Ultimately, that was the basic storyline of what happened, although they may have gone to the finish early. Shamrock had been out of action since coughing up a lot of blood in Muncie, suffering what was first believed to be a perforated lung, but later diagnosed as a lung infection. On his second big bump of the match, taking a power bomb from Vader, he again began coughing up blood. According to reports, both Vader and WWF representative Bruce Pritchard appeared very concerned in the ring at that point, and they went right to the finish, with Shamrock being unable to get up by the count of 10 and the referee stopping the match at 7:17. Vader in the cage was screaming to get a doctor into the ring. Shamrock was scheduled to be examined by his doctor early in the week after returning home, and his status for the October 5 St. Louis pay-per-view show depended upon the extent of his internal problems. Originally, when FMW and WWF agreed to send Shamrock to the show, the plan was for him to face a martial arts star in a worked match, with him going over in front of a huge crowd overseas in what would be purported as a shoot match and have the match air on Raw the next day. As it turned out, FMW was unable to get a martial arts star that would both fit the qualifications of being able to have the box office chemistry with Shamrock to make the fee FMW was paying WWF for Shamrock's services and agree to do the job for a price within their budget. Instead, they went with Vader, one of the biggest foreign attractions in Japanese wrestling history, as a package deal, believed to be a $100,000 to the WWF for both men, and again with the idea of Shamrock going over before a huge crowd to be broadcast on American television. The finish was likely changed since they had decided to instead book a rematch between the two in Japan rather than a one-match series, and it was felt it was better to put Vader over in the first meeting. With Vader's face turn in the United States being decided after the agreement for this match was in place, this match doesn't make storyline sense to air in the US as was the original plan and isn't likely to be aired. However, the WWF acknowledged the match and its result on Raw the next night. 1. The opener was a 12-man Royal Rumble Battle Royal featuring Koji Nakagawa, who does a Bret Hart gimmick, Ricky Fuji, Masanori Morimatsu, Tetsuhiro Kuroda, Mr. Pogo 2, Gasaku Goshigawa, who does a Sandman gimmick right down to the lengthy ring entrance to the same music, the guzzling beer and swinging a cane, Haido Ieo Takayama, Hideki Hasaka, Super Leather, former WWF wrestler from another lifetime Corporal Mike Kirchner, the Headhunters, Victor and Manuel Santiago, Flying Kid Ichihara, Akihito Ichihara, and Battle Arts wrestlers Alexander Otsuka and Minoru Tanaka, the same Tanaka who had recently appeared on a few shows for rings including doing a legit shooting match, which is quite a contrast to say the least. Match was said to be really bad, ending with Kuroda pinning Fuji in 28-29 after a Thunderfire powerbomb. 2. Crusher Maidamari, Yoshika Maidamari, and Miss Mongol, Aki Kanbayashi, beat Kaori Nakayama and Miwa Sato when Maidamari pinned Sato in 12:34 after a choke slam. Said to be bad. 3. Mr. Ganasuke and Hisakatsu Oya, Kenichi Oya, retained the FMW World Brass Knucks Tag Team titles, beating Gedo, Kiri Takayama, and Jado, Shoji Akiyoshi, in 15:02 when Ganasuke pinned Gedo with a Thunderfire powerbomb. Said to have been a good match. 4. Shark Tsuchiya, Eriko Tsuchiya, pinned Asia Kong, Eriko Shiseido, to become the WWA and Independent World Women's Champion, both titles vacant since the retirement of Megumi Kudo on April 29, in 1825. It was interesting politically to see Kong put over both Tsuchiya and Chigusa Nagao in the same basic 1-week period in her first 2 major matches since leaving AJW. Tsuchiya used a huge knife to cut up Kong. Miss Mongol brought out a fire extinguisher, and it was sprayed in Kong's face, and she was eventually pinned after taking a fireball to the face. Mongol and Maidamari both interfered in the match freely. Said to have been a good match. Bruce Pritchard was videotaping this match, and you can read into that whatever you wish to. 5. In a match billed for the old NWA Texas Heavyweight Championship, Terry Funk pinned Hiromichi Fuyuki in 12:23 in a loser leaves FMW match. Funk was managed by Victor Quiñones. The match was filled with constant interference, with Gedo and Jado helping Fuyuki and the Headhunters helping Funk. The finish of the match was Headhunter splash Fuyuki off the top rope, flattening him, and then Funk pinned Fuyuki after a moonsault. Also said to have been good. 6. Vader, Leon White, beat Ken Shamrock in 7:17 when Shamrock failed to get up for the 10 count in the Ultimate Rules cage match. The idea is that there were no disqualifications, and that the only way the match could end is via tap out or knockout. Shamrock came out with his ribs all taped up and Vader constantly worked the body with punches knocking Shamrock down. Shamrock got a few submission moves in but Vader managed to escape them. After Vader delivered a power bomb and Shamrock began coughing up a lot of blood, they went right to the finish. 7. Masato Tanaka captured both the Independent World Heavyweight title and the WWA World Brass Knucks title, pinning the Gladiator, Mike Alfonso, after a powerbomb in 15:18. Said to have been a really good match with a lot of heat. 8. Kenta Kobashi and Manukiya Mossman beat Jinsei Shinzaki, Kensuke Shinzaki, and Hayabusa, Eiji Izaki, in 21:30 when Kobashi pinned Hayabusa after a released German suplex, a rolling elbow drop and a clothesline. This was described as one of the greatest wrestling matches of all time, said to be on a par with the best matches with Mitsuharu Misawa and Kobashi vs Akira Tao and Toshiaki Kawada. Shinzaki and Hayabusa did well to work within the very physical style of the All Japan wrestlers, and Mossman was said to have shown remarkable improvement. Kobashi was injured during the match, having internal bleeding in his left thigh. He was said to have gotten the biggest pop of anyone on the show. Even more amazing about this performance is that Kobashi, Mossman and Hayabusa had worked a show earlier that afternoon at Korakuen Hall and all three worked in very hard matches. 9. Atsushi Onita pinned Wing Kanemura, Yukihiro Kanemura, in 1741 in a no-rope barbed wire electrified dynamite landmines time bomb death match. The stipulations of this match were that if Onita lost, he'd have to retire. If Kanemura lost, then he'd have to break up his Wings group, so he now has to go by his real name rather than as the leader of the Wings group. Kanemura was working the match with a broken leg suffered just 1 week before the match. There were 80 small bombs around the ring on the barbed wire cage, 12 bombs outside the ring, 8 landmines outside the ring and 12 giant bombs to explode at the 15 minutes mark. At the 10-minute mark they sounded the alarm for the big explosion, and the big bombs went off and they blew up the ring at the 15 minutes mark. After the dust settled and the smoke cleared, they went to the finish with Onita scoring the pin with his trademark Thunderfire power bomb. These two couldn't follow the previous match at all, combined with Kanemura's injury and even with the explosion gimmicks, so it came off as a so-so match. In the Japanese press, Onita had stated that he was going to meet again with the WWF rep at this show about him going to the US and doing his bomb match there. This is something Onita has talked about for more than 1 year or since the first dialogue between FMW and WWF was set up, leading to all kinds of rumors. At this point, nothing has been decided. I'd suspect WWF will get a tape of this match and then make a decision, but the downside of all this is it's the kind of match that may come off as too barbaric to Americans, a very important issue in these days of pay-per-view censorship. In addition, the match pretty much needs to be held outdoors as I can't see a major indoor arena in the US allowing that type of a spectacle, and WWF is strongly against running pay-per-view shows outdoors because of the risk involved with potential weather problems and lighting problems. The first loss by a Gracie since NHB became popularized in the United States with the advent of UFC in 1993, was averted by a riot on September 27 at Rio de Janeiro's Tijuca Tennis Club that turned into a real-life war zone and adds Rio to the places where the entire future of NHB is threatened. Renzo Gracie, 4-0-1, was facing Eugenio Tato, a famous Luta Livre fighter from Brazil, in the main event of a show called Pentagon Combat put on by Nelson Monteiro when the Jiu-Jitsu and Luta Livre practitioners at ringside began arguing and brawling and a full-scale riot broke out in the match and show had to be stopped. Based on reports from Brazil, The fighting started in the stands early in the match when Gracie got the first takedown and held the early advantage. An estimated 150 to 200 Loto Livre practitioners, including many students of Tato, rushed the ring as their mentor was on the receiving end. One of Tato's students in seconds was kicking Gracie through the fence from ringside throughout the fight, and Gracie managed to deck him as he stuck his head over the cage, throwing a punch that knocked him off the fence. At this point, another second started trying to climb the fence, and Renzo's brother Ryan began fighting him. However, even Gracie himself admitted that he blew up during the match, which he attributed to overtraining. He claimed to have beaten the shit out of Tato, who was bleeding from the lip, the nose, and underneath the eyes and had to be hospitalized after the match, but most reports felt the match was even overall. Most reports also indicated Tato, who needed 11 stitches to close one of the cuts, had taken control of the match when the riot got out of hand, including reports of several gunshots fired in the air, but luckily no one was hit by a shot. At one point Gracie went down from a leg kick, which appeared to be out of exhaustion, and he stayed on the ground rather than standing back up, which was about 13 minutes into the match, which had been scheduled for 3 rounds of 15 minutes each in duration. By this time the riot outside the ring had gotten even more out of control, with the jiu-jitsu and Loto Livre students fighting each other with chairs throwing. When chairs hit the ceiling lights and broke them as they fell into the ring, the place went dark and the match had to be stopped without a decision being rendered. The brawl was said to have been the worst in recent memory at a Vale Tudo match in Brazil, and having seen tapes of some of the fights in the stands at those shows, which go far beyond anything you'd ever see in the US, that is quite a statement, although reports were that nobody was seriously injured in the brawl. There was talk the next day that Vale Tudo may be banned completely from the city of Rio de Janeiro because of the fan violence. Both the mayor of the city and governor of the state said they wanted NHB events banned because of the unruliness of the fans. Tato gained fame in Brazil many years ago battling Royler Gracie to a 40-minute draw, in which, according to some reports, he held the upper hand. He was scheduled to face Ralph Gracie at the final EFC pay-per-view show, but a few weeks before the show the match was cancelled under strange circumstances. The public report was that there were problems getting a visa for Tato, but Ralph Gracie also claimed beforehand to have suffered an injury, a report others were dubious of. The belief going in was that Renzo, who bulked up to 182 pounds for the fight, would be the larger of the two, since Eugenio fought years ago at 150 to 160 pounds. However, he weighed in at 185, and Renzo Gracie told Vale Tudo News that he looked juiced and claimed he wasn't able to finish him by submission because he had oil all over his body, which allowed him to slip out of his holds. Gracie, who has another fight scheduled on October 11th at the Pride 1 Japanese pay-per-view show at the Tokyo Dome against Akira Shoji, considered an easy opponent, challenged Tato to a rematch but said he wanted the match in a closed gymnasium with nobody there except for 1 second for each fighter and someone to videotape the fight if the winner gets the rights to sell the tape. There were 2 other matches on that show involving internationally ranked NHB stars, with Brazilian star Murilo Bustamante, 5-0-1, best known in U.S. circles for his 40 minutes time limit draw with Tom Erickson, knocking out former UFC lightweight tournament winner Jerry Bollander, 6-2, of Lion's Den with a hard kick to the jaw while on his back at about 7 minutes, and Oleg Toktarov, 9-3-2, knocked out Sean Alvarez, 1-1, in 3 minutes using a boxing combination. Toktarov has been training extensively of late in boxing and won his first pro boxing match in Atlantic City just 3 weeks ago. Alvarez is best known for a 36 minutes win over Kingdom's Yoji Anjo in a shoot match last November in Japan. It was mainly a stand-up fight. Renzo Gracie, Bollander and Bustamante were ranked numbers 3 through 5 in the world in the under 200-pound weight class behind Kevin Jackson and Igor Zinoviev in the latest Fighting Sports newsletter rankings. Ricardo Moraes, 7-0-1, the moderately skilled Brazilian giant, who won the second Russian Absolute tournament and destroyed Yoshihisa Yamamoto in a ring shoot match in 1996, knocked out Sergio Muralha in less than 1 minute. The unprecedented 5th and final stadium spectacular of the year promoted by New Japan Pro Wrestling on November 2nd at the Fukuoka Dome had some of the matches announced this past week. The show will be headlined by a non-title match with IWGP champion Kensuke Sasaki versus mentor Riki Choshu, in the next-to-last match of Choshu's career as he winds it up on January 4th at the Tokyo Dome. The fact this match is non-title could signal one of 3 things. 1, Sasaki is going to drop the title at the end of the month as he's got a title defense again and as of yet unnamed wrestler before the show. 2, Choshu is going to win the match, which doesn't make much sense since Sasaki has never pinned Choshu and this would be his last chance. Or 3, Sasaki is going to win, but by making it a non-title, it doesn't give it away as obviously. The other 2 matches announced are a J-Crown title defense by Shinjiro Otani against Wild Pegasus, Chris Benoit, and a first-time ever tag teaming of Jushin Liger and Tiger King, Satoru Sayama, probably the two most influential junior heavyweight wrestlers in modern history, against Tatsuhiro Takaiwa and Koji Kanemoto. In addition, there will be 3 martial arts/UFC-style outsiders brought in for the show to work as opponents for Don Frye, Naoya Ogawa and Shinya Hashimoto respectively. Puerto Rico. Don't have a report on the show at press time, but they were promoting a major show on September 27th in Caguas, and a similar lineup on September 28th in San German, called Bombazo 97 with Ray Gonzalez vs. Golden Boy, Chiqui Star, in a Universal title and hair vs. The Mask match, Carlos Colon vs. Invader No. 2 in a cage match, Los Pastores, Sheepherders, vs. Invaders No. 1 and No. 3, Ricky Santana defending the Puerto Rican title against the returning Dutch Mantle, Ram Man and Lawley vs. the Freebirds, Terry Gordy and a wrestler billed as Michael Hoyt, El Profe vs. Rico Suave and a loser has to wear a dress match, Tiger Mike Anthony vs. Muhammad Hussein, Steve Rivers vs. Larry Hamilton and Herbert Gonzalez vs. Skull Von Crush. Rivers is a wrestler out of Calgary who has worked the past few years on indies in that area. Mike Anthony is also the Calgary-trained wrestler who has worked around the world, also as Mike Lazansky. Larry Hamilton is from Northern Florida and has been around for probably 15 years. He did jobs for years on the old Georgia Championship Wrestling show, and is billed as the Worldwide Wrestling Champion wearing a belt, which may be the name of his indie organization. On September 20th in Humacao, they had a title versus title bout with Gonzalez versus Hamilton, which ended with Rico Suave and Golden Boy hitting the ring and cutting Gonzalez's hair, leading to Gonzalez agreeing to put his belt and his hair on the line against Golden Boy's mask. They also did a TV angle where Chiqui Star was out doing his segment with his bodyguard and the fake Golden Boy, and they all attacked Gonzalez after Gonzalez said that Star was the real Golden Boy. Mexico. We have very little other than promo. Azteca's television show has been airing the past 2 weeks on Saturday afternoons at about 1 p.m. Central Time as opposed to the post-midnight slot a few weeks earlier. On the show this weekend, which was taped on September 19th, Tarzan Boy and Zorro and La Parca and Team Niebles Jr. beat Black Magic and Pierroth Jr. and Jerry Estrada and Steel via DQ on top. Steel was just in for one shot on his way to All Japan. All Japan. The company held its 25th anniversary party on September 26th at the Capitol Tokyo Hotel in Tokyo, inviting an estimated 1,200 sponsors, reporters and friends. Giant Baba gave a plaque to Mitsuo Momota, Lord James Blears, the figurehead PWF president, and referee Joe Higuchi for being with All Japan from the start of the promotion in 1972, and also gave a trophy to Jumbo Tsuruta for being with the company for 23 years, and also to Masaofuchi, Fuchi, Mitsuharu Misawa, Toshiaki Kawada, Akira Tao, and Stan Hansen. They opened the new tour on September 27th at Korakuen Hall with a television taping before a sellout 2,100 fans. The top matches had Kenta Kobashi over Takawa Mori, Hansen and Bobby Duncombe Jr. beating Masao Inoue and Kawada, and the top, Steve Williams and Gary Albright in a lacrosse, beat Misawa and Jun Akiyama and Manukia Mossman when Albright pinned Mossman. The September 28th Korakuen Hall show, which began at noon, as Kobashi, Mossman and Hayabusa worked both this show and Kawasaki Stadium that day, was headlined by Kobashi and Johnny Ace and Mossman beating Tao and Kawada, and Yoshinari Ogawa and Misawa teaming with Hayabusa for the first time ever to beat Satoru Asako and Jun Akiyama when Hayabusa pinned Asako using his Firebird, Scorpio 450, splash. The biggest show of the week was September 29th in Matsumoto before 3,200, headlined by 3 main event singles matches with Misawa over Albright in 13:42 with the discus elbow, Kobashi pinned Akiyama in 21:57 with a clothesline, and Williams pinned Ace in 15:26 with a backdrop driver. The show wasn't taped for television, which is unfortunate because we're told that Kobashi vs. Akiyama was considered by many of the reports as a strong match of the year candidate and generally considered as Akiyama's best singles match ever and Kobashi's best match of the year, which both cover one hell of a lot of ground. September 14th television show did a 3.6 rating. New Japan. New Japan held a press conference on September 26th which not only announced the top of the Fukuoka Dome card, but also announced partial cards for the next tour, which will be from October 10th to October 31st, called the NWO Typhoon Tour. The gimmick is that this is actually an NWO tour and not a New Japan tour, and they are giving out NWO press credentials and having Masahiro Chono act as the promoter for the tour. Chono said that during the tour the NWO would win both the IWGP Heavyweight and Tag Team titles, and he'd spray paint them NWO. The gimmick is also that the NWO refuses to announce what members will be in what specific matches on the tour, so the only matches announced were largely New Japan undercard matches. The major shows are October 19th in Kobe with Kendo Kashin vs Tatsuhito Takaiwa, Jushin Liger vs Shinjiro Otani in a non-title match, Tadao Yasuda and Takashi Iizuka vs two members of Heisei Shingan, Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi and Shinya Hashimoto vs NWO, and the main event will be Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki defending the tag titles against Chono and Keiji Muto, going as an NWO heel but without the Great Muta gimmick on this tour. October 25th in Kagoshima, Liger vs Koji Kanemoto, October 27th in Nagasaki, El Samurai vs Takaiwa, and the final is October 31st in Hiroshima, Kashin and Samurai and Liger vs Takaiwa and Otani and Kanemoto, Yasuda and Iizuka and Junji Hirata vs Ishigan, Kojima and Nakanishi vs NWO, Yamazaki and Hashimoto vs NWO, and Sasaki defends the IWGP title against an NWO member. While Antonio Inoki, Naoya Ogawa and Satoru Sayama were on tour in the Netherlands, there was a Muay Thai show in Amsterdam, Holland on September 27th, and on the show they had a judo rules match where Ogawa beat Lance Browick in 2:15 with a sleeper. Jushin Liger will work on October 12th for the Small Wrestle Dream Factory promotion against one of its undercard wrestlers, doing a double shot since New Japan has an afternoon show that day at Korakuen Hall. They had been doing an angle where they were teasing Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara leaving High for NWO, but the two shook hands with Shiro Koshinaka and apparently are staying with High, but that's an angle that'll likely be worked on the next tour. Brian Johnston got real good reviews for his first pro match on September 23rd against Ogawa. September 13th television show did a 3.7 rating. Other Japan notes. The Rings show on September 26th in Sapporo drew 4,820 with Kiyoshi Tamura scoring his first career win over Folk Han in 12:48 with the armbar submission, which would be the first time Han has put anyone over using a submission finish in more than 1 year. No doubt Rings has had the top guys trade off wins with lots of upsets over the past few months to make the upcoming Battle Dimension tournament, which starts on October 26th at Tokyo Bay NK Hall and ends in January with the annual biggest show of the year at Budokan Hall, that much more interesting. The tournament will crown Rings' first ever World Heavyweight Champion. This will make an interesting take, because judging from the results and what we've heard, there is a good chance that the first 4 matches on the show were shoots but the top 2 were works. Rings is generally doing this pattern because shoots are unpredictable as far as entertainment value, and that even though the most highly anticipated match on the show was the Frank Shamrock vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka match, which Shamrock ended up winning 1-0 by getting one rope break escape after the 2 went 30 minutes. There's no guarantee a shoot match won't be boring, so you put the shoots on early, and Tamura on in the main event, and you're almost guaranteed a great end of the show. Speaking of the Shamrock Kosaka match, it'll be interesting to see how both are physically for the October 11th IWF pay-per-view show that both are fighting on coming off such a long match. Akira Maeda beat Andrei Kopelev in 8:32 with the choke sleeper in what was almost assuredly the other worked match, while the other Lion's Den fighter, Pete Williams, beat Holland's Joop Kasteel in 8:25 when Kasteel blew up and couldn't continue in a match described as not being very pretty. Lots going on behind the scenes in regards to the Pancrase vs. Rings promotional feud. The basic deal is that there is a very popular late-night weekly show on the Fuji network in Japan called SRS. The people who produce that show also do the Pancrase home videos. SRS is a 30-minute show, and every week they talk about some combat sport, generally K1, Pancrase, Shudo, or Vale Tudo. While they had never publicly said it, Rings had never been featured on the show since so many of the matches are worked. Well, the Fuji network executive, whose name I believe is Kai Hara, must have said that the reason they don't cover Rings is because some of the matches are worked, which actually started the Rings Pancrase feud because Maeda responded to that, and then Yoshiki Takahashi at the last Pancrase show did the grandstand challenge to Maeda. Anyway, in the strangest twist of all, Hara this past week was forced by the network to write a public apology letter to Maeda and Rings for that statement, as I guess the Fuji network has some sort of a policy about telling the truth. You have to apologize on the rare occasions you tell it. Speaking of Maeda, he did a major magazine interview this past week where he referred to himself as a pro wrestler and not a martial artist, which would be the first time in years he's used that term to describe himself. He also said that he would be retiring in 1998 and again talked about wanting to have his final match against George Foreman or Mike Tyson, of which there is little or no chance of that happening. I'm not sure if this had anything to do with it, but Fuji Network was negotiating to air the December 20th Pancrase show on primetime network television, which due to the exposure levels, would have changed the balance of power and been an incredible boost to the promotion, but the deal fell through. The last time SRS did a Pancrase show it did a 4.6 rating, which for a show that airs post-midnight on a weeknight is phenomenal. This may hurt the chances of Pancrase bringing in Tom Erickson for that show. Pride 1 held a press conference on September 24th for the Tokyo Dome show. We've heard a lot of conflicting reports on how ticket sales are doing, but most reports seem to indicate the advance for this show is poor, with less than 10,000 tickets having been sold. Rickson Gracie is in Japan training for the match and is said to be weighing 198 pounds, which is about 13 pounds more than he weighed for previous fights in Japan. Nobuhiko Takada is either training in secret or taking time off from training due to an injury. It's been reported he has a stomach injury and he didn't show up at the most recent Kingdom card on September 20th where he was supposed to do an autograph signing. The injury could also be a cover story to give him an out in the event he loses badly. After Kawasaki Stadium, Atsushi Onita held a press conference to basically do his own NWO angle where he announced he was quitting FMW and starting up his own promotion. Onita said he would work 3 dates on the next FMW tour, including major show on October 14th in Sapporo and October 19th in Sendai, but would feud with the FMW babyfaces like Hayabusa, Jinsei Shinzaki and Masato Tanaka on top rather than team with them. He said he would be opening up his new promotion in December with 4 major shows that month, the biggest being at Sumo Hall, and would use talent not only from FMW but also ECW, WWF, All Japan and New Japan on his shows. It's a gimmick rival promotion like Wing Kanemura's Old Wings group inside FMW, which had to disband with Onita beating Kanemura at the stadium show. The November 9th K1 show at the Tokyo Dome, which will be an 8-man one-night tournament, set an all-time record selling the building out in just 1 hour, and tickets were put on sale on September 27th, which for those of you keeping track would be something like a $6 million first day of ticket sales. Mitsuya Nagai of Rings had a kickboxing match on September 28th at Korakuen Hall for All Japan Kickboxing but lost via decision to a 20-year-old American kickboxer. With Dan Severn off the October 12th Sumo Hall Kajiwara show, the main event is now Yoshiaki Fujiwara vs. Super Tiger, Satoru Sayama in yet another Tiger outfit from his UWF days, with Antonio Inoki as referee. Genichiro Tenryu has opened up a sushi bar in Tokyo called Shimades, which is his real last name. LLPW held its 5th anniversary party on September 26th in Tokyo, which took place at the same time as the All Japan party. Tiny Mouse and Yoshiko Tamura, formerly with AJW, are working the big shows for JWP. On September 24th, at a baseball game at the Tokyo Dome between the Nippon Ham Fighters and Lauda Orions, Great Sasuke threw out the first pitch, and as a post-game gimmick they held a baseball game between the wrestlers of Michinoku Pro and the wrestlers from Battlers. Shadow 7 Inches Big Japan, who teams with Shadow 5 and Great Pogo, is Mexican wrestler Rocky Onita Santana. Terry Funk worked main events all week for FMW leading up to the stadium show. Asia Kong, Kyoko Inoue, Etsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda all worked this week for AJW since the local promoters paid them for the shows, but the shows this week, including back-to-back shows on September 27th and September 28th at Hakata Star Lanes, drew poorly. On the women's front, former AJW front office spokesperson Hiroshi Rossi Ogawa will be starting up a new promotion using Mariko Yoshida as CMLL Women's Champion as its top star. A correction from last week. On September 20th in Kawasaki, the title belt that Devil Masami won beating Zero Chigusa Nagayo was the All belt and not the WCW belt, so I'm assuming the latter title is now vacant. USWA things remained largely status quo this week. Larry Burton failed to get his injunction to get the video equipment away from the Selker Group, which had it locked up. In addition, the main house show of the week scheduled for September 23rd in Louisville was canceled by the Kentucky State Athletic Commission because nobody had a promoter's license. The September 16th show was saved when they used Jerry Lawler's license, however, with Lawler having to be in Albany, New York for WWF tapings, he wasn't there. The commission shutting down the show garnered some local publicity, particularly since the wrestlers picketed the building. The television this week was another highlights from the past, with them doing no hints or angles or storylines or building up to anything for the future. The featured stuff on the show was showing some angles leading up to in the match where Lawler beat Kurt Hennig in Memphis to win the AWA title back in 1988. Ironically, September 20th television show, which was a taped highlights show from the past, did a 5 rating, which is better than some of the poorer rated Saturday morning live shows had done. However, reports are that WMC TV isn't going to take sides in the current dispute and won't let either tape a show until their differences are settled, and there are people who believe if they aren't settled within a week or two, that the station will simply cancel the wrestling show and it would leave the company without its by far most valuable station. Here and there. As it turned out, Conan did wrestle on the September 28th show in Chino, California, which drew about 600 fans. It wound up with Mil Mascaras and Hector Garza and Rey Mysterio beating Conan and Yokozuna, Samoan Savage, a sub for Yokozuna who has moved back to Connecticut for a return to the WWF, and Psicosis via DQ when Conan fouled Mascaras, and in a lumberjack strap match, Silver King and Super Calo and Super Muñeco beat Juventud Guerrera and Doink the Osborne and Damien. The IWF pay-per-view show was shockingly banned in Canada by Viewers' Choice of Canada. With no striking of any kind allowed, this will probably be the single least violent contact sport pay-per-view event of the year, but it appears that since Canada has a hard-on for the promoters of the event since they were the same promoters of the now-defunct EFC that ran into all kinds of problems running that show on the Indian reservation in Quebec when the Canadian and Quebec government didn't want them in the country, that VC Canada is banning the show. They held a press conference in Sioux City, Iowa during this past week and among other things, announced that the 3 judges for the show would be Kurt Angle, the 1996 Olympic gold medalist in wrestling, Russ Hellickson, the current wrestling coach at Ohio State, which produced Mark Coleman and Kevin Randleman, and a 1976 Olympic silver medalist and Gene LaBelle, the former longtime pro wrestler, announcer and promoter and in a later martial arts magazine incarnation, the toughest man in the world during his prime. The rules for this event and point-scoring system favor the wrestlers above the submission fighters and were designed to favor the wrestlers in order to get the seal of approval of USA Wrestling. Just like UFC, IWF is looking for approval from an outside agency to satisfy the written qualms of TCI Cable that the sport isn't independently regulated like pro boxing as its excuse to not carry NHB. Tsuyoshi Kosaka of Rings, who faces Tom Erickson in the main event on the show, is currently in California training for the match at Lion's Den. The tentative date for a second IWF pay-per-view show is January 31st. New Japan wrestler Osamu Nishimura captured what is being called the CWA Shoot Fight Championship, having nothing to do with actual shoots, in a match beating Robbie Brookside on September 21st in Austria. USA Pro Wrestling is very close to finalizing a deal to become a seasonal amusement park attraction in Australia. In what may be a first, Angel faces Lady Vendetta on November 30th in Cleveland for Cleveland All-Pro Wrestling in a women's thumbtack match. Dennis Corraluzzo is planning a show on February 27th and February 28th as the annual Eddie Gilbert Memorial in New Jersey, and there are plans to honor a few other major names from the past at the weekend festivities. Local Minneapolis area magazine City Pages ran a story on former wrestler and trained Eddie Sharkey, who is still promoting independent wrestling in the area. Flash Funk and Bart Gunn worked over the weekend for the Pennsylvania Championship Wrestling promotion. Ace Darling beat Gunn for the group's America's title on September 26th in Reading, Pennsylvania. Championship Pro Wrestling is running October 19th in Martinsburg, West Virginia at the Cadillac Club with Demolition Axe as the headliner. If any area readers contract CPW at Box 2225, Hagerstown, Maryland 21740, they can get $1 off any ticket. Dave Prozik and AJ Sparks are starting a group called American Wrestling Council with its first show on December 13th in Iselin, New Jersey at VFW Hall. USA Pro Wrestling on November 28th in Perth Amboy, New Jersey at St. Mary's Church Gym has Tito Santana vs. King Kong Bundy, Bam Bam Bigelow vs. Pitbull No. 2 plus Jimmy Snuka, Demolition Axe, Devon Storm, Manny Fernandez, Cousin Luke, and Ace Darling. NHB. There was a UFC piece on the September 25th CBS TV show 48 Hours which ran head-to-head with the live ER season opener, so did a distant third in its time slot in the ratings. There was nothing groundbreaking in the piece, as they couldn't decide if they were doing a piece on a mother horrified about her son doing UFC. Unfortunately, they picked the mother of Mark Coleman leading to the Dan Severn match, and she wasn't all that emotional. More like any mother would be if her son was in a contact sport event. About how bloodthirsty the fans in Dothan, Alabama were, they picked the stereotypical ones who talked about liking blood, or just UFC. Severn and Coleman were both interviewed in the piece, which was filmed at their match in Dothan. There will be a Brazilian show on October 30th featuring a tournament with Randy Couture and Mario Sperry. The next IFC show will be October 25th in Shreveport. On the show on September 20th in Fort Bears, North Dakota, where Dan Severn beat John Dixon in the main event, U.S. Greco-Roman national team member Matt Lindland won the middleweight tournament, and they had a 45-minute draw in a women's match with Laura Donovan versus Victor Schultz, and will probably rematch then in Shreveport. ECW. The family of Eric Kulas filed charges against Jerome Young, New Jack, for assault and battery and assault with a deadly weapon stemming from the November 22 incident in Revere, Massachusetts. But the charges were thrown out by a magistrate in Boston on September 23, citing a lack of evidence and feeling this is a case that would be better served in a civil lawsuit rather than with criminal charges. The Kulas family has yet to file a civil suit against ECW, and no doubt the filing of the charges, which actually took place several weeks ago, was a tactical move to strengthen a potential civil case, but with the charges being thrown out, it won't end up helping their case. It would be foolish to try and predict how this would go if there was a case filed. However, there are a lot of statements that Kulas has made in the media regarding the incident that could backfire on him. However, the potential risk to ECW of playing a tape of the incident in front of an unpredictable jury could be huge if it were to get that far. This past weekend saw shows on September 26th in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and September 27th in Orlando, Florida. The former show was said by almost all reports to have been pretty bad and the latter to have been pretty good. Neither Tommy Dreamer nor Sandman worked the weekend due to injuries, but Sabu did work. Dreamer has a deep heel bruise and a banged-up shoulder and did attend both shows and explained his injury. Sandman didn't come to Fort Lauderdale, but appeared in Orlando with bandages over his eyes, so they used the deal where Sabu threw fire at him at the ECW arena as the storyline reason for his not wrestling. Actually, his back injury from more than 1 month ago still doesn't permit him to work a match. They'll have him sell the eye injury until the back heals enough. Dreamer's situation seems to be a week-to-week type deal. Sabu suffered a detached retina and supposedly was told by his doctor that he needs surgery. His eye looked like hell over the weekend and he was wearing a patch while he wasn't in the ring, but he's still working and did a 30-minute draw with Taz in Orlando. Paul Diamond, Vampire Warrior, Marty Jannetty and Mr. Puerto Rico, Dave Sierra, all worked the weekend shows. Diamond, with USWA is bad shape, will probably be in full-time while Warrior and Jannetty probably won't be in. Mr. Puerto Rico basically just worked the shots since they were in Florida and he lives there. Dory Funk worked against Shane Douglas in Orlando and put him over in an ECW title match. Crowds both nights were in the 1,100 range, with them using three-way dances with New Jack and John Cronus over Dudley's and Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney as the final match both nights. Doug Furness and Phil LaFawn worked as a tag team both nights, first beating Al Snow and Diamond in Fort Lauderdale, and then winning 3 bouts in Orlando over Puerto Rico and Davey Morrison, the FBI and Mikey Whipwreck and Spike Dudley. Terry Funk was inducted last weekend into the West Texas On Hall of Champions. Funk was a lineman at the school from 1962 to 1965 when it was still called West Texas State. Dory Funk, who was a lineman a few years earlier, was inducted into the Hall of Champions in 1990. This past week's TV show aired Bam Bam Bigelow vs. Spike Dudley, FBI vs. Rotten and Mahoney and Dudley's losing the tag titles to New Jack and Cronus from the September 20th ECW Arena show. Bigelow Dudley was a really good short squash with superheat, like the kind you have to see to believe, built around the spot where the fans body surfed Spike around ringside, after Bigelow threw him into the second row. After the match the fans were chanting one more time, Otra, Otra, and Bigelow did it again, but this time the fans didn't surf Spike around, so that part was edited out on television. FBI match was mainly to get Jeff Jones over doing the heel ref gimmick. Let's just say if this was WCW or WWF doing something that came off as amateurish, people would say it was horrible. Tag title change was a short brawl. The very little wrestling that took place wasn't good, but the brawling with objects was stiff and the heat was really good. New Jack didn't dive off the roof, but actually off the balcony by the entrance of the building onto a table. They did an upset in Orlando, having Jerry Lynn go over on Chris Condito. The situation with Justin Incredible PJ Walker is that he's under contract to WWF through August of 1998. He's attempting to get out of his contract to sign with ECW, but thus far WWF hasn't released him, although Paul Heyman is working to get the release. The WWF perspective seems to be that the last thing they want is for a guy who is something like 24 years old that they started to get hot in ECW and then use it as a stepping stone to WCW like so many others have done. It appears that the top matches on the November to Remember pay-per-view on November 30th in Monaca, Pennsylvania will be Sabu vs. Sandman in a ladder match, a three-way dance for the tag titles with Rotten and Mahoney, Dudley's and New Jack and Cronus, and Dreamer vs. Van Dam. October 18th at ECW Arena will be Bigelow and Condito vs. Furnace and La Fawn, Mahoney and Rotten vs. Dudleys with the winners to get the next title shot. New Jack and Cronus vs. FBI for the tag titles. Credible vs. Whipwreck. Great Sasuke vs. Lin and probably Taz vs. Van Dam for the TV title. The main event is tentatively slated as a triangle match for the title with Douglas, Dreamer and Sabu, but that depends on the MRI results on Dreamer's heel and ankle and whether he'll be able to wrestle by that time. ECW will be starting on WTGI, Channel 61 in Philadelphia on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. with a first-run show. Upcoming dates are October 10th in Rostraver, Pennsylvania, Douglas and Bigelow vs. Sabu and Van Dam, New Jack and Cronus vs. Dudleys for belts. October 11th in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, Douglas vs. New Jack and Cronus vs. Mahoney and Rotten. October 24th in Waltham, Massachusetts, New Jack and Cronus vs. Dudleys, Douglas and Bigelow vs. Sabu and Van Dam. October 25th in Revere, Massachusetts, Taz vs. Sabu, Douglas vs. Bubba vs. Cronus for the tag title. So Heyman still isn't booking New Jack into Revere. Bigelow and Condito vs. Furnace and La Fawn. October 30th in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, Douglas, Dreamer, Sabu three-way for title. New Jack and Cronus vs. Mahoney and Rotten. Van Dam vs. Lin. Taz vs. Condito. And October 31st in Stamford, Connecticut, Taz vs. Sabu, Douglas vs. X. Dreamer vs. Van Dam flag match. New Jack and Cronus vs. Dudleys and Rotten and Mahoney three-way. Credible vs. Lin. WCW. On the injury front, Kevin Nash apparently had knee surgery during this past week and isn't expected back until late November. Ric Flair is expected back at the end of October or the 1st of November. Scott Hall was on crutches all weekend but is expected to be back for the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view show. Dean Malenko injured his neck in a September 26th match in Fairfax, Virginia against Steven Regal, and no word on how long he'll be out of action, although he missed Baltimore and Nitro in Worcester, Massachusetts. With all the injuries and the fact Hall, Nash and Flair were all advertised high on the weekend cards, it wound up with Kurt Hennig moved up to team with Syxx against Lex Luger and the Giant on top, in matches where Hall used his crutch to interfere for the DQ, and then bringing Sting unadvertised to both shows to make the post-match babyface saves. Part of the reason as well for Sting appearing in those two cities and their proximity to Washington, D.C., where the Hogan vs. Sting Starrcade match will emanate from. The situation with Hall was kind of strange, as there was an argument before Nitro on September 22nd, in West Valley City, Utah between he and WCW promoter Zane Bresloff about the short and generally unsatisfactory main events with all the big houses at the arenas of late. Then Hall came down with a bad back, although those close to him say he had been complaining of the back injury over the weekend, and showed up for the weekend shows on crutches. What appears to be the Havoc show at this point is Hogan vs. Piper in a cage match with no ref, Hall vs. Luger with Larry Zbyszko as ref, Page vs. Savage in some sort of a gimmick match, Guerrero defending the Cruiserweight title against Mysterio Jr., which appears to be with Mysterio Jr. putting up his mask, Jarrett vs. McMichael with some sort of a stipulation involving Deborah having to get out of wrestling if she loses, and Disco Inferno vs. Jacqueline, hopefully not for the TV title, and maybe Giant vs. Scott Norton, although the latter is totally speculative with Nash out. Nitro on September 29th in Worcester, Massachusetts drew a sellout 11,078, 9,533 paying $216,512. Members on the entire card, and Steven Regal beating Hector Garza by submission with the Regal stretch in less than 2 minutes of a match where Garza got no offense and the match got no heat. Show opened with Diamond Dallas Page beating Marcus Bagwell in 6:34 with the Diamond Cutter, also giving one to Vincent who tried to interfere after a ref bump. Good opener. Rey Mysterio Jr. beat El Caliente, who was Eddie Guerrero under the mask, in 5:26 with a double springboard Hurricane Rana in another good match. The fans pretty much knew from the start it was Guerrero, as there is nobody else in WCW with 4% body fat, and chanted Eddie sucks, and when the fans picked up on who it was, the announcers acknowledged it as well. Mysterio Jr. unmasked him afterwards. Before this match, Mike Tenay started his feature on Mexican wrestling. It was basically an introductory piece which showed clips of old-time legends like Rey Mendoza and El Santo, and also had clips of non-WCW wrestlers like Lizmark, Negro Casas, and El Hijo del Santo. The idea is to put over the masks so it'll mean something when guys put their masks at stake in the US in the future, although if they have Mysterio Jr. unmasked this soon, which was the plan, they're more than rushing things. Giant did an interview and said nothing, which wound up being contagious. Bill Goldberg got his second upset over Barbarian with a suplex slam in 3:09. They said Goldberg was a former All-SEC defensive lineman at the University of Georgia from 1986 to 1989 and played with the Falcons. Barbarian seemed visibly less than pleased having to put him over. Goldberg has potential and size, but this was bad. Zbyszko did a great interview putting over his ref bit. Disco beat Juventud Guerrera in a TV title match in 4:37 with the Gourdbuster when Jacqueline, who was at ringside wearing as little as possible along with Alex Wright in bright yellow pants, tripped Guerrera. Guerrera looked good and Disco looked fine. Savage and Liz did an interview where they said nothing. Jarrett beat McMichael in 11:03 when he attacked him from behind when Steve was distracted after being slapped by Deborah. They acknowledged, which is a shoot, that Deborah had left Steve and moved to Atlanta. She wants to be an actress. Real bad match. Six and Hall on crutches did an interview. And they've got the nerve to say Flair's interviews have too many cliches. Six and Jericho went to a non-decision in a match where the crowd was dead. Hall interfered and began roughing up ref Scott Dickinson, slapping around his ample midsection before Zbyszko and Luger made the save. Flair did a phone interview. He said he wanted to break up the Horsemen and told Benoit and McMichael to go their own way and said what happened was his wake-up call. To show how much the left hand knows in this company what the right hand is doing, the booking committee just released shows and had promos cut for all sorts of shows with the Horsemen managed by Arn Anderson against the NWO at house shows in early November. So go figure. They aired a video from Brown University students. Hey, they're still in college and they looked older than I do. For what it wasn't bad, but it was way too long and the crowd live booed it heavily and it killed what had been a pretty boisterous heel crowd up to that point. Bischoff did an interview and said little. Luger racked wrath in 4:44 of an incredibly bad match even by Luger standards. Finally Giant beat Hennig via DQ in 3:22 when all the NWO interfered and Sting made the save and cleaned house to a huge pop at the end. Match wasn't good, but Hennig did get a big pop when Giant went up for his fisherman suplex and kicked out. Ratings saw Nitro do a 4.03 rating, 4.25 first hour, 3.86 seconds hour and 6.24 share, which is phenomenal against both Raw and NFL in the second hour. Raw did a 2.74 rating and 4.18 share and the Nitro replay did a strong 2.09 rating and 4.12 share. The irony again is that the 3 segments of Raw that aired after the live Nitro went off the air actually drew a lower rating than the 5 head-to-head segments. In fact, when Nitro went off, Raw fell from a 2.9 to a 2.3, losing 445,000 homes. The 41-minute block of the Nitro replay going against the last 3 segments on Raw saw the Nitro replay do a 2.56 rating to Raw's 2.53. The 5 head-to-head segments saw Nitro at 3.86 and Raw at 2.86. Nitro started strong and as always, peaked at 8:45 p.m. to 9 p.m. with a 4.6 rating for Disco Inferno vs. Juventud Guerrera. During the second hour, the rating fell except for one phenomenal jump from a 3.5 to a 4.4 for the segment with Six vs. Jericho and the Ric Flair phone interview. Since the Six and Hall interview segment did such a low rating, one would have to attribute it to the Flair interview that was promoted throughout the show. The 5 head-to-head saw WCW at 3.9 Savage interview McMichael vs. Jarrett, to WWF's 2.9, Michaels, Helmsley, Rude interview, Slaughter out, Hart Foundation confrontation, WCW at 3.5, Hall and Six interview to WWF's 3.1, Vader vs. Bulldog, WCW at 4.4, Six vs. Jericho and Flair interview to WWF's 2.6, post-match with Vader and Patriot vs. Hart's, Farouk video and Farouk vs. Johnson, WCW at 3.8, Brown University video and Bischoff interview to WWF's 2.8, Nation of Domination post-match with Shamrock Johnson at LOD, Pillman's 30 Files, beginning of Sultan vs. Goldust, and finally WCW at 3.7, Luger vs. Wrath, Hennig vs. Giant and Sting finish to WWF's 2.9, Goldust Sultan finish, Austin MC Mahan confrontation. Other weekend numbers saw main event at 0.9, Saturday night at 1.6 and main event at 1.1, which would rate it in that regard as just about the lowest rated weekend for TBS wrestling in history. Estimated buy rates for the September pay-per-view shows are WWF Ground Zero on September 7th at 0.45, which would be 130,000 buys, and with the price increase would be $1.67 million, which is a big increase on what the In Your House series used to gross with a lower price tag even though total buys were down. And WCW's Fall Brawl on September 14th did in 0.53 buy rate or about 150,000 buys and $1.83 million, which is way down from what they've been doing most of the year on pay-per-view, and you can draw your own conclusions as to why. Mine is that they didn't let anyone know what the card was until the day before the show, and they've done so many mystery main events and people have felt ripped off afterwards. that they aren't buying shows based on a surprise. A lot of fans, like close to half the regular audience, no longer watch the weekend television and stick only to Monday, so by not having the card finalized by the Monday prior to the pay-per-view, they hurt themselves in the pocketbook. The reason WCW did the angle where Hall gave ref Mark Curtis the edge on September 22 Nitro is because Curtis, Brian Hildebrand, who is in his mid-30s, was diagnosed with stomach cancer and underwent 4.5 hours of surgery on September 24, in which they had to remove his spleen and much of his stomach. The belief is that the surgery removed all of the cancer and he'll be able to return to work by the end of the month. He's the second WCW ref in as many years to get cancer, as last year Randy Anderson had a battle with the disease. WCW is no longer on WCBS in New York, but worldwide will be moving to WUR in a Saturday 11 a.m. time slot, which is also available on satellite. The weekend show saw September 26th in Fairfax, Virginia draw $5,636 and $119,571, and September 27th in Baltimore drew $7,388 paid, $8,593 total, and $136,697. Basic WCW both nights with good wrestling underneath and short matches with little wrestling on top. Merchandise for the week was $169,826 or $7.53 per head. The Nitro on November 3rd in Philadelphia sold 5,200 tickets for $114,000 the first weekend they were on sale, which is behind the advance for the sellout at the previous Nitro but well ahead of the pace of the second house show at the Spectrum. Minneapolis on October 6th should top $200,000, and Nitro in Tampa is already more than $100,000. TBS is changing from being a premium pay station to a basic cable network throughout Canada starting in the fall. The reason for the change is because so many wrestling fans in Canada have been requesting TBS on basic cable. Jim Duggan and Belfast Bruiser David Finlay are returning. Raven debuts on the house shows in November against Scotty Riggs. November 2nd at the Scope in Norfolk, Virginia has Flair vs. Hennig, Luger and Page vs. Hall and Six, Jericho vs. Regal, Raven vs. Riggs, Public Enemy vs. Faces of Fear, and Goldberg vs. Bobby Eaton. November 7th in Kansas City has Flair vs. Hennig, Benoit and McMichael vs. Bagwell and Norton, Guerrero vs. Malenko, Steiners vs. Harlem Heat, Mysterio Jr. vs. Juventud Guerrera, Ray Traylor vs. David Taylor, and Duggan vs. Belfast Bruiser. November 16th in Dayton, Ohio has Luger vs. Hall, Flair and Benoit vs. Hennig and Six, Page vs. Norton, PE vs. Fear, Jericho vs. Jarrett, Riggs vs. Regal, and Yuji Nagata vs. Mortis. Phil Mushnick on September 22nd in the New York Post wrote a column saying that Ted Turner should do something to help the kids in the U.S. that won't cost him $1 billion to give everyone at WCW 2 weeks' notice. He criticized WCW for promoting physical abuse of women, sexual harassment, terrorism, negative ethnic and racial stereotyping, homophobia, vandalism, Dennis Rodman, and graphic and mindless violence. Let's see, physical abuse of women is more ECW. Sexual harassment goes across the board, but I'd give WWF the edge lately on that one. Terrorism, I'd lean toward WWF. Negative ethnic and racial stereotyping, WWF big time. Homophobia, WWF in the past, but right now everyone's pretty tame. Vandalism, across the board. Rodman, that fits WCW. Graphic and mindless violence seems to say ECW. He also pointed out how, after confessing to years of steroid abuse, that Turner hired Hogan to be his company's top star. It appears Hogan's booking idea is to do another run with Flair in singles to lead to his face turn next year. I guess the theory is that Hogan and Flair vs. Hall and Nash will draw, which it should, that fans will be less likely to boo Hogan as a face with Flair at his side. True, particularly in certain parts of the country, and that with Flair in the match, there is always someone willing to do the job. WWF. Raw is run in DQs on September 29th, was taped September 23rd in Albany, New York before 4,174 fans paying $69,498. Michaels and Helmsley played total smartasses, putting the devil sign behind Vince's head over and over again and basically not acknowledging or putting over Rude, who was standing there with them. Hart Foundation came out. Slaughter came out and announced Helmsley vs. Undertaker on TV. Michaels and Helmsley seemed to think they were on the Comedy Channel, as they were hilarious, although they continued to get a lot of internal heat. By the way, despite what has been said by many people, Michaels was fined for the deal in Muncie, Indiana, which says that the incident wasn't have been a work on the boys unless it is still to this point a work on the office as well. They aired highlights from one night only in England, and the post-show heat with Michaels was incredible. Vader beat Bulldog via run-in DQ 8:30 in a bad match as Bulldog's knee was clearly bothering him, and they did a post-match where the Hart Foundation buried Vader and Patriot under the Canadian flag. They showed a Farouk video of his football days. "Hey, I remember Ron Simmons in college and he was one of the best players in the country as a junior, but that was almost 20 years ago." Farouk advanced to the IC tourney final beating Ahmed Johnson in 2:17 when Johnson hit the ref for a DQ. They did another post-match with LOD and Shamrock vs Nation of Domination. The original plan was for Johnson to win this match and go to the finals against Owen, but he tore both a tendon and some nerves in his hand the night before when it was ripped open by an exposed nail on a table and needs surgery, so he did this match to explain his elimination before getting the surgery. With Farouk vs Owen for the IC belt, and with Austin having to present the belt to the winner, you can probably guess where that's headed. That makes the pay-per-view six-man Shamrock and LOD vs Kama and D. Lo Brown and Rocky Maivia. Pillman's Triple X files showed him in bed with an unhappy Marlena doing jokes like "look low" and saying "I'm bushed." Goldust beat Sultan. McMahon, who wasn't selling an injury at all from the previous week, confronted Austin and gave him three alternatives by next week: either get a doctor's release, sign a waiver absolving the WWF of any liability in case of injury, or be fired. Obviously he picks door number 2 since he's starting back in the ring in what will be billed as non-sanctioned matches on October 18th in Fort Worth. In real life, that depends on him being cleared by a doctor, although the belief is he's recovered well and is feeling good. Real good segment. Headbangers kept the tag titles, losing via DQ to Jesus and Jose when Godwins attacked Bariquas as they had the match won in 10:20. Those tag belts sure mean a lot these days. Crowd was dead, match was awful, and rating was in the toilet. Owen Hart did an interview wearing an Owen 316 shirt saying, "I just broke your neck on the back with a SWAT team with him." As it turned out, one of the guys took their helmet off and it was Austin who gave Hart the stunner. Finally, Undertaker beat Helmsley via DQ in just 1:52. Vader, Patriot, Brett, and Bulldog brawled before the match. Rude, Michaels and Chyna interfered and put Taker in a body bag. He sat up and got out of the bag and cleaned house. He chased Michaels up the Titantron as the show went off the air. They edited off the show the part where fans chanted "Sean is gay," and he climbed down and kissed Helmsley like he was Prince Charming, which I guess makes Helmsley the frog. Brackus worked a dark match beating Rockabilly. For Shotgun, Mark Marrow beat Salvatore Sincere using the STF as his new finisher. Brian Christopher and Jerry Lawler beat Flash Funk and Scott Taylor. Rocky Maivia beat Chains. Thrasher beat Henry Godwin. LOD beat Nick Barbary and Bert Centeno. Pillman beat Patriot via DQ and Goldust interfered. And in post-show dark matches, LOD and Goldust beat Pillman and Owen and Bulldog in 45 seconds when Goldust pinned Pillman, and Taker beat Brett via DQ in 8:13. Michaels, Helmsley, and Chyna are the new clique. Maivia was also spitting up blood after the Madison Square Garden show. Weekend TV ratings saw Livewire at 1.1 and Superstars at 1.6. House shows for the week saw September 25th in Toledo draw $5,530 and $98,659. September 26th in Fort Wayne, Indiana drew $3,134 and $58,286. September 27th in Rockford, Illinois drew $4,475 and $78,144. September 28th in Champaign, Illinois drew $5,402 and $91,160, and the tour ended on September 29th in Green Bay drawing $3,649 and $61,667. Merchandise for the week was $180,288 or $6.84 per head. Don Callis from Winnipeg will be replacing the Commandant as the manager of the Truth Commission, doing a more traditional Bumping Hill manager role. Commandant and WWF were having visa problems and problems getting his family moved in from South Africa, plus the concern that they want managers to take pratfalls, and a guy who was an actor in his late 40s that doesn't know how to bump could get hurt. October 24th at Nassau Coliseum has Brett vs. Undertaker, Austin and Dude Love vs. Owen and Bulldog, LOD vs. Michaels and Helmsley, Goldust vs. Pillman, Shamrock vs. Vega, Vader vs. Farouk, Bangers vs. Godwins for tag titles, Marrow vs. Sultan, Patriot vs. Rockabilly, Johnson vs. Maivia, Crush and Chains vs. Kama and D. Lo Brown. Despite reports to the contrary, Taka Michinoku has not signed a WWF contract, although it is expected that he will do so when he returns from Japan in mid-October. Bulldog will be out of action until the pay-per-view, resting his bad knee. His brace was broken in England and he tried to work a few days without it, but after September 25th in Toledo had to sit out the rest of the week. Matt Ghaffari hasn't signed but will be coming in for another week of training shortly. Due to some negotiation problems, not all the pay-per-view carriers in England carried one night only, so the universe wound up being lower than expected. Virtually all the reports we had on the show were positive, with the last 3 matches generally all around 3.5 stars. The working idea is to do a second show with Michaels vs. Bulldog on top sometime around next April, and to do 2 PPVs in 1998 in England, and maybe as many as 4 in 1999. The readers' pages. Anderson. On the second night of Arn Anderson's comeback after the stabbing, he wrestled Shanghai Pierce in Raleigh, North Carolina. After getting the win, he left via the heel aisle. About halfway out, he realized his mistake and slowed down almost imperceptibly, beckoning Pierce to catch up. When Pierce caught him, Arn threw him into the hockey boards, pummeled him some more and left him laying. Anderson then picked up the mic and said, "I might have left the wrong way, but I tell you this, he sure did. I can only hope the retirement of Arn Anderson doesn't permanently eliminate the word selfless professional from wrestling. He is truly the last of his kind, and thank goodness he was allowed to leave the right way." J. Reddick. Greensboro News and Record. Greensboro, North Carolina. At the risk of raising the ire of the more reverent fans of your readership, not to risk further justifying the huge egos of those involved, I have to say the NWO Arn Anderson retirement spoof was absolutely hilarious. Sean Waltman played Flair down to every unflattering detail in the way only someone who despises him could bring out. Nash was funny as hell, as usual, I guess figuring he should make all that time in the makeup chair worth the while. Khan was funny just standing there. Bagwell sucked, and it did drag on too long, but I was hooked just waiting for Waltman to break into another spastic Flair impression. It was enthralling television and may be the best thing the NWO has done to date to get them hated by what is, regardless of the success of the NWO gimmick, generally a horseman-driven fan base. Instead of it being a slap in the face of heroes, hopefully this can be looked back on as the beginning of a heated NWO versus Horseman feud. Of course, that is dependent upon certain NWO members being charitable enough to do jobs, which I'm sure letters like this putting them over doesn't help the cause of. I even turned off the Packers versus Bears, and normally it would take nothing short of a firearm to get me to do that. Matt Creamer. Green Bay, Wisconsin. So Kevin Nash thinks that wrestling fans don't care about Ric Flair. Funny. Flair has not only been one of pro wrestling's most talented performers for more than 20 years, but also one of its biggest drawing cards. In contrast, Nash was perhaps the all-time biggest flop, a complete and total failure during his reign as WWF champion. Can you think of one person, excluding brief transitional champions like Stan Stasiak or the Iron Sheik, who was a bigger flop in that role? Although Nash gets an impressive pop when he shows up on television, he's yet to provide any tangible evidence he's the marquee player he seems to believe himself to be. How many sold-out arenas has Nash played to when he's been in the advertised main event singles match on the card? How many pay-per-view shows has he headlined as a single that have done record buy rates? Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that question can be answered without having to use too many fingers. To me, Nash is a flash in the pan. Does he honestly believe he has one iota of the talent Flair has? While Flair is not what he once was in the ring or even behind the mic, his staying power over the years has been absolutely amazing. On the other hand, I'd be willing to bet every last penny of Nash's overpriced contract that he'll prove to be one of the many wrestlers who were major stars for a brief period of time but didn't have the talent to stay on top for the long haul. Despite what Nash might like to delude himself into believing, fans today still care about Flair. Does anyone, even Nash himself, believe he'll be as big a star when he nears 50? Flair is a legend of this sport, a man whose ability will be the standard others are judged against for years and years. Nash is more like another Sid or Ultimate Warrior. He's a guy with a unique look and a load of charisma that allows him to get over to a level beyond his ability. Nash would be wise to learn from these two men. They were both thought to be the future of pro wrestling, until fans caught on to their utter lack of talent. The sad thing is, it appears Eric Bischoff's on-screen role as the ultimate NWO mark is actually a shoot. Because of the obvious preferential treatment Nash received, he'll most likely be given the green light to use his unofficial booking power to try, like so many before him, to bury Flair. It doesn't take a trained psychologist to know that anyone with this kind of bizarre animosity Nash seems to have for Flair is actually hiding a deep sense of envy. It isn't hard to figure out why. Flair, even in the very twilight of his career, is almost as over as Nash, in the prime of his. Second, and far more importantly, long after both men have retired, Flair will always be one of pro wrestling's all-time greats. Nash is destined to be remembered as just another oversized egomaniac who was his own biggest fan. Sam Knorr. Laguna Niguel, California. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. October 6, 1997. This is the end of this program. See you next time.